One of the biggest problems about trying to talk about Kabbalah and all things Kabbalistic, there is no good place to start. If you're trying to learn this material, if I'm trying to teach the material, wherever you begin, it always presupposes and assumes you know something else. There is no good place to begin to learn something, because it's such a complex set of material. There are so many facets, features, dimensions, applications, and different variations on the model. Wherever you begin, it's hopeless. So when I first started learning this stuff, I was a student and I wasn't really interested in the stuff I was supposed to be studying. So I was learning Kabbalah and magic. That was my entry into all this stuff. I was reading lots of different books, understanding very little of them. However, as I read more things, there would be things I would read in this book that would explain a little bit about something in a previous book. I think, oh, now I understand what that means. And so over a while, you sort of accumulate an understanding and knowledge of it. Fortunately, these days, there is the internet. Lots and lots of groups and forums online, and lots of YouTube videos and other forums as well, I'm sure, are available, which makes it a lot easier to begin to learn what all this stuff is and what it's about. So in this particular video, I want to give really a very loose introduction into tarot, what I do with tarot, what it means to me, why it's so important, blah, 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 and hopefully dispel a few myths that I think some of you may well have. I started out with tarot and Kabbalah. There are 3 versions of Kabbalah. There's Kabbalah with a Q. This is the Western magical tradition, which basically pretends to be rooted in the Jewish Kabbalah, which is Kabbalah with a K. And then you also have the early Christian interpretation of Kabbalah, which is Kabbalah with a C. They are 3 very, very different applications. One of the things the Judaic Kabbalists are doing is they're looking at the first 5 books of the Bible, so the Old Testament, and looking at hidden passages, hidden meanings, and symbolic representation within that. There is a large amount of that within the Western Kabbalistic tradition, but nothing to the degree of that the Jews will be doing with this. Now, if you go to Israel, which is obviously the Jewish homeland, where you'll find an awful lot of Jewish Kabbalists, the general population regards the mystical Jews, the mystical Kabbalists out there, as nutcases. It's not something that carries a particular high status within society. They are very much a fringe, very much the nutters of the community. Now, within Judaism, though, you're going to find an awful lot of mysticism and a lot of mystical Kabbalists who are worth paying attention to. My own experience of finding various teachers over the years is that most of them are nuts. Much like you'll find in any of the Western magical groups and magical lodges and organizations. I've been a member of a variety of different groups and still am a member of a number of groups. And there is an attraction to the crazy element. So in the backdrop to studying Kabbalah, you have to bear in mind there is a lot of nutters that get attracted to it, and so not everything that you find will be authoritative and make any sense, because it is really little more than psychosis. But it's psychosis that's shared by other people. It's fantasy type stuff. Now, within the Christian Kabbalah, you're going to find a lot of stuff coming out of the Gnostic tradition. That's Gno, Gnostic. And if you're unfamiliar with Gnosticism, it's something I think is worth studying. Gnosticism isn't a thing, it's a label placed upon a category of early Christian literature, which was essentially at variance with what the early Christian church was attempting to establish. Because you have to bear in mind, at some point, everyone following that tradition was Jewish, and then people adopted these doctrines, and then those doctrines had to be formalized, because in the early days there was lots of disparity worldwide as to what people call themselves Christians, what they were actually doing. And so it was the Council of Nicaea was one of the first things to actually form around about the 324, 325 was their first meeting to try and formalize what the doctrines would be. Now, the Christians who refused all that stuff and were looking at other things, largely mystically inspired through a lot of Kabbalistic notions, not just Kabbalistic notions, there was others too. Their stuff is regarded as Gnostic. But to think of the Gnostics as a particular sectal group is a mistake. That's not what they were. Now, scroll forward a lot of years to the 1900s. And in the 1900s, there was a magical revival where Western interpretation of Kabbalah, largely occurring through characters like Eliphas Levi, who was actually Catholic, devout Catholic, in fact, and Freemasonry starts to adopt an awful lot of the Jewish Kabbalah and the Christian Kabbalah, start to apply magical interpretation on it, following Western magical traditions, and reviving some of the medieval practices as well. And the next thing you know, we have the Western Kabbalah, and that had been evolving for quite a long time prior to the 19th century. So that's a little bit of the history. So it's hugely convoluted. There's lots of traditions, lots of threads. So if you read two books on Kabbalah and they don't seem to be talking about the same thing, that could be why. And if people want any books and recommendations, I can leave it in the comment section. I'll answer any questions you have, and I can make recommendations there. There are so many recommendations I would give. It all depends on what is it you would want to get out of it. What would be your purpose? What is it you want to learn? Now, what we have here is the what is known as the Tree of Life, or the Sefer Sephiroth. And essentially, just to give some of the wording, we've got these circles here. They are Sephira. And then we have the straight lines in between them, and these are paths. These are the paths that connect the Sephira, or the Sephiroth. There's 10 Sephira, 22 paths. There are variations in Kabbalistic tradition. This is the one that I use. I'm not going to go into all the variations, because what's the point? Find one, pick it, stick with it, and find the one you like, stay with that one. But there are variations. Now, here is how this is generally regarded. The Sephira are representative of objective, external, hardcore stuff. So it's objectivity. The paths connecting them are subjectivity. And what we can do is use this, for want of a better term, as a system of organization, or as Aleister Crowley referred to it, a filing cabinet in which to start using these as categories to start organizing experience and organizing archetypes. And for me, as a therapist, as someone who works with metaphor, someone who has a longer background in magic and Kabbalah than I do in therapy, it's also a very, very useful way of sorting out concepts as well. And I want to just give a little introduction into how that happens. Now, one of the things we also have with the evolution of the Kabbalistic traditions, you also had the evolution development of the tarot deck. Now, the tarot deck didn't start off as a singular thing. This was a collection of different stuff, probably through games and through ways of communicating symbols and storytelling, that kind of stuff. And that was a separate tradition to Kabbalah. The tarot deck has 78 cards, 22 trumps, 10 court cards, and 16, what do we call them? They're the court cards. Let me start that again. It has 22 trumps, 10 numbered cards, of which there's 4 suits, so there's 40 of those, and 16 court cards, which are your king, queen, and so on. So it's very similar to the playing cards deck. It just has extra cards in it. Very different tradition to this. However, they start to develop over time within storytelling and symbolism, and largely drawing on archetypes. The tarot deck starts to become a visual documentation of symbols, much like Kabbalah did. Now, anything that is attended to by multitudes of people over long periods of time tend to take on an archetypal nature. Let me just give you an easy example. It's the one I always use, so forgive me if you've heard this before. Look at what's happening with Christmas and the Christmas story. So Christmas within the Western tradition is largely two things that have collided together. We have the ancient pagan traditions, which were occurring around about the winter time, and then impose upon that with Christian dominance in the West. They then put in, okay, this is where we're going to have Christ Mass, so the birth of Christ gets imposed on it. Today what we have are traditions that are drawn both from the pagan roots but also from the Christian imposition upon that. But no one really cares. No one really cares about those things. It's just something that's from our childhood we like to recreate, and people, you mustn't cancel Christmas. Like this year, the cancelling of Christmas was such a political thing. The big event is a central thing in our calendar. Now, over time, it started to change. So Santa Claus starts to emerge, and that comes again. That's the number of you have Saint Nicholas, Saint Santa Claus. Very similar. You have the traditions from Scandinavia, you have traditions from Germany, traditions from other parts of Europe that start to coalesce to become Santa Claus, and you have the Green Man. If you have a look at, type in Santa Claus Green Man, you'll see Santa Claus used to be green because it comes from the Green Man tradition, as well as St. Nicholas and other things that start to coalesce into a single entity. And then around about the early 1900s, advertising gets in, and Santa Claus then becomes red. Coca-Cola probably had a huge influence on that. It's not the only influence, but a huge influence. Now, so we now have Santa Claus, but he's not the same as Father Christmas. You see, Father Christmas is only one, but Santa Claus is everywhere. And so you have these weird things. And we also have the invocation of Christmas. We're creating the spirit of Christmas. So we have the Holy Trinity. We have Father Christmas, Santa Claus, and the Spirit of Christmas. And if you do the rituals right, it feels like Christmas. You have the Christmas spirit has descended. And so we have this recreation of another archetype from elsewhere. But it starts to get more interesting, because then along the lines, a song gets made. I think this was in the late 1800s, where in a song, Santa Claus is referenced to coming from the North Pole. And that wasn't thought of before then. So now we have the North Pole narrative. Now within that, reindeer start to get added in. And then the reindeer get named, and then the stories are attributed to those reindeer. And we have Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And then we have all the other things that happen. So now the story starts to get embellished and becomes quite creative and starts to expand and develop. But it's not solidified yet, because there are still elements being added. The Americans in recent years have added in the Grinch. You have a variation going back years in Germany, and I can't even pronounce it, but it's the demon of Christmas. So you have lots of elements that are beginning to get added in and become involved in the story. The story has not solidified. It is still being adjusted and corrected over time. Now, 100, 200 years from now, it may well be solidified. It may take more generations than that. Kabbalah has been the same thing. It has evolved and become tweaked here and there and adjusted here and there. The tarot deck was undergoing the same process, and eventually it began to solidify. Because both take on an archetypal nature, because that's what tends to happen. Archetypes emerge when the group mind work on something over long periods of time. It starts to become archetypal, because archetypes are things that are true to all people. They start to take on very strong similarities, and it was Eliphas Levi who was the first person to to make the attribution, at least publicly make the attribution. There's 22 paths and 22 trumps. So we can attribute a trump tarot card to each of these paths. There are 10 numbered cards of 4 suits. Oh, we've got 10 numbers here, so we can attribute the numbers to these things. Now, within Kabbalah, there are what's called the 4 worlds. We only see it in 2 dimensions, but actually you would see 4 of these stacked on top of each other, for want of a better description. So we have the 4 worlds. So there's your 4 suits, your 10 numbers, your 22 trump cards. And then we have the 16 court cards, which are a little bit inconvenient for the system, but they still fit in here actually quite well as well. So around about the mid-1800s, Eliphas Levi was the first person to start publishing that actually these things are the same. Then along in the early 1900s, you have the Golden Dawn, and they then formalize the system, which then gets adjusted later on. So now what we have is this as a useful representation of tarot symbolism, and tarot symbolism as a useful representation of this. There's a recursive relationship between the two. But this is a Western imposed tradition You won't find this in the Christian Kabbalah. You won't find this in the Jewish Kabbalah. This is an entirely created, invented Western magical concept that is borrowing a lot of stuff from Judaism. So now let's just go through what some of these Sephira mean and where the tarot would fit in here. So down here, this is Malkuth. Forgive me if you're a native Hebrew speaker. Much like every other person I've ever met in the magical tradition who is not Jewish or a native Hebrew speaker, none of us pronounce any of it right, but we just copy what everyone else says, and that seems to be the way. So what we end up with as being Hebrew in no way would be recognized in Israel. I can be fairly sure of that. So down here is Malkuth, and this basically is interpreted as kingdom. This is the world of manifestation. This is the physical world, everything you can see and touch. It gets misattributed as being the planet Earth because there's planetary attributions up here. But it's not the planet Earth, it is the physical body of the universe. So the manifest universe is down here. This is the lunar sphere, Yesod, and this is very much, Yesod means foundation, and in Yesod this is the lunar sphere. The moon is an archetypal symbol, and the way to picture this is moonlight reflected off still water. And it is the archetypal symbol for the unconscious, the subconscious, for dreams, all stuff that's below the surface. The moon doesn't produce its own light, it reflects that of the sun. And so the moon reflecting light onto the pool of water, and of course what's happening under the water, is representative of subconscious stuff. So this is very much representative of all those things. So this is my physical body, the physical world. This is the subconscious mind. Hod over here, which actually translates as splendor, is generally regarded as the sphere of the intellect. It is where intelligence is attributed. It is where the sciences, the world of medicine, the world of magic, that kind of stuff. But more specifically, it's not intelligence as in what you know, it is the will to intellect. The best description here is, this isn't the library, it's the decision to go to the library in order to learn. That's what Hod is representative of. Over here, we have Netzer, which means victory, or triumph, it's sometimes interpreted as. Now, Netzer over here is much more about the creative stuff. Hod is representative of the planet Mercury. The moon is Yesod, but over here it's Venus. And so Venus is much more the creative, artistic side of stuff. Intellect, creativity, left brain, right brain. These are ways you can categorize this. And if we just come up to here, we have Tifereth, which translates as beauty, which is the sphere of the sun. And sun is representative of consciousness itself, of manifestation, of life, that kind of thing. Then above here we have Gibora, which is generally is strength. This is all the martial stuff. Guess what? It's Mars is attributed to here planetarily, and so this is representative of all of the male martial archetypes and force, strength, might, war, anger, rage, vengeance, all those kind of things. And Hesed over here, this is where Hasidic Jews come from. It's from Hesed. This is very much of Jupiter, and this basically means love, of loving kindness. This is mercy over here. So this is the ability to strike. This is the ability to forgive. And then we get into much more archetypal stuff here, which is this is the archetypal father, this is the archetypal mother, and then that's the combination of the two going right up into divinity. So all well and good so far. Now we can attribute everything as martial to this one here, attribute everything that's about loving kindness and forgiveness into this one here, and so on. So we make attributions. The paths between the two are very representative of tarot symbolism, tarot trumps. And I'm just going to give you a few. There's no point in trying to teach the whole thing, because as I say, this is an enormous subject, because then we have to go into what is an archetype, and why are they even important, and why are they organised that way, and we would be here for a very, very long time, and that's not really what I want to do for this video. But let me just come into this path here. So this is the 29th path. It's attributed to a Hebrew letter, because guess what? There's 22 Hebrew letters, which also match to each of these paths. That is from the Jewish Kabbalah, but also match to the tarot trumps. So a tarot trump, as well as being representative of a path, is also representative of a Hebrew letter. The Hebrew letter is what comprises, obviously letters comprise a word. And so the Jewish Kabbalists are looking at words to break down their mystical construct, because God created the universe through speaking it. And so we can actually start to interpret, effectively, the divine will by the interpretation of the symbols and so forth through the Hebrew letters. At this point, I just need to emphasize a few points. So, do I believe in God? Do I believe in tarot? No. Forget anything to do with belief. Here is one of the problems that tarot has. Because of what it is, just like everything else, it gets jumped. There's a bandwagon gets jumped on by large numbers of people who then don't really understand what they're doing, but they understand a little bit and then jump on it. So tarot now is for fortune telling, it's for divination, it's for reading the future. Really? And you know what? I have to deal with that a lot, which is why I so rarely reference tarot. Because the moment I do, people go, oh yeah, I've got the tarot cards, oh I do tarot readings. Oh dear God, please go away. And there's no point in me even attempting to communicate anything deeper with that person. It's just like when people use astrology for divination and fortune telling. Here's the deal, just while I labour the point here. COVID-19, did anybody, any astrologer, psychic, medium, tarot reader, in fact anybody, predict it? Nope. Just like every other major world event. Now, given the sheer body of predictive literature, if you sift through all of it, you're going to find one that matches. But, and it's like, it's true, that person predicted it. Really? What about the thousands and thousands and thousands of other predictions they made that are absolute bogus, just like everything else? So, I don't give any validity to any of that. The majority of tarot decks that are produced are lovely. They're lovely works of art. Don't deny that. But they have no reference to the archetypes whatsoever. They have no validity as far as archetypal tarot symbolism or Kabbalistic symbolism goes. There are very, very few decks that do. The vast majority of them are just people making pretty art and calling it tarot when it's not at all. For me, this is just like if you read NLP for Dummies. I was astonished that that book got past the publishing review, because there's nothing in that book that I recognise as being NLP. And I do wonder about the authors of that book and the people that published it, if they ever actually attended a real NLP training. But you know what? They probably did attend trainings that were called NLP trainings. They just didn't know what they were being taught wasn't NLP. And there's so much of that in every field that doesn't have an objective measurement to it. So you're looking at chemistry, science, physics. There's objectivity it can be measured against. The moment we're into worlds of subjectivity, it's very, very hard to have any form of quality control. And so therein lies the difficulty. Now, the reason why I so rarely publicly talk about these kind of things is because it drives me insane that the vast majority of people will immediately go, so can you tell the future? Can you make predictions? I've been involved a lot over the years with alchemy as well, and everyone, whenever this is what I never mentioned publicly, apart from now, really, because the moment I say, well, I'm an alchemist, if I were to label myself in that way, oh, you're trying to turn lead into gold. Because throughout the years of alchemy being an operating philosophy, the charlatans jump in there and will be selling the lead into gold philosophy, selling the courses. It's no different to the snake oil salesman today selling NLP, hypnotherapy, personal development and coaching. What we're seeing today in terms of the bastardization of the concept has always happened. And then people learn those things, they think that's what it is, write books on it, other people learn those things, write more books on it, they reference each other, quote each other, and now there's this massive body of knowledge and literature that's entirely bogus, and no one realizes. And this is such a problem for anyone who wishes to be taken seriously with Tarot, Kabbalah and that kind of stuff. And so it is a problem, and so I can't deny that. So let's just have a look We'll just do 2 cards for this particular video. Let's keep it brief. The Moon is the card that's attributed to the Moon trump card, to this path here that connects Malkuth, which is kingdom, the manifest world, to that of creativity. Now, the moon symbolism, I won't go into that symbolism, but I'll just describe it to you. It is typically, there are two pillars, 2 hills, 2 towers, two upright things of some description. There is water, there is a valley between the 2 things, there is a dog and a wolf, so a tamed dog and a wild dog wolf, and they are howling at the moon. And there's usually a crab or lobster type imagery at the base of the card. Now, these go very much into astrological and ancient metaphor and into archetypes. Now, the moon card as a path is not the same as the planetary attribution of the moon that's attributed to Yesod. These are slightly different variations on the concept. Now, if we were to do an initiation, if I were to create an experience of the path of the moon, of what this card represents, of what it symbolizes, we could go through a lengthy analysis of all of the symbolism and the archetypes, or we could actually create a little experience for the person. And the way we could do that would be simply, the moon card is symbolic of intuition, but all the stuff that comes with intuition. You see, everyone has degrees of intuition, but we also have degrees of stupidity that come with it. Oh yes, I'm very intuitive, as you know. Yes, I think I'm quite psychic. Yes, I always know when my girlfriend's going to phone me. I can always feel it. And you start to get this. They start off with, we can all intuit things about the world, but people take it to a ridiculous degree, and the logical extreme of intuition goes into superstition, where now we have all sorts of weird religious morality and social behaviors because we're superstitious as well. And that then goes into like blowing out the candles, make a wish, that kind of stuff. Being frightened of witches, being frightened of being hexed. There's lots and lots of variations on this, and lots of people will say they're not superstitious, but they are. Just look at how many people are terrified of dying. What happens to them after death. People still have. We have a whole society that has this morbid fear of death, despite it being absolutely inevitable for every living being on the planet, for everything that's ever lived, everything that's going to live. But we live in a complete denial of it. We've constructed this bizarre reality. That seems to be a logical extension of intuition and where that would take us to, if you think how it would go. So, intuition is largely your senses, how you construct the world through the senses, but without vision. And so to have this experience, you'd be blindfolded. And the initiation we would use initiation as a term, we would have a person undergo a journey, and we would have two rooms. One is organised with the symbolism of Malkuth. I'm going to save that for another day. And the other room is organised with the symbolism of Netzer. And essentially the person is going to navigate their way between the 2 rooms. We would orientate them to their Malkuth room, which is all lovely decorated and it's got all the right things going on. We would then stick a blindfold on them, open the door, push them through the door. They don't get a choice. Out you go. But they don't know this is the structure. They don't know what's going to happen. Now they have to get from one place to the next. They're blindfolded. They have to find their way. But what we're going to do is we're going to put things in the way. We're going to make them frightened. We're going to create experiences for them that are absolutely real, except they're not. The person doesn't know. They would have no way of knowing this. So, for example, it might well be they go through the door and they're into this journey, whether it's a corridor or whether it's you're out in an open field, or however it is that would be between these 2 venues. They've got to feel their way. They don't know which way to go. They have no... People lose their sense of direction very fast when they're blindfolded and they have nothing to hold on to. Somebody might whisper to somebody else, careful, he's going to fall in that hole. There is no hole. Somebody else might say that have you put up the tripwires? There are no tripwires. We can start to put things in there that would cause them concern. But all of those things don't exist. So we're going to give the person an experience of being confronted by superstitious nonsense that's not happening, it's not real, but everything suggests to them it is real, and they have to find their way through that nonsense. That's what this path represents. The best symbolism I've heard of this, best description is it's midnight. You're in the forest. It's pitch black. You cannot see a thing. In the distance, you hear wolves, and there are witches about. But you don't know whether the wolves are actually tame or not, because they might be dogs. And there aren't actually any witches, but because of the times that you live in, there are witches. And you now have to try and get your way through and get home. Now, here's the suggestion that I would put to this. Once we have understood and been initiated into those concepts, and we have learned to overcome, both develop intuition without going into its absurd conclusions, and we're able to do that without being tripped up, being misled by our own illusory senses, we are able to connect our creativity to the real world. Think about what the schizophrenic does. Think about what the narcissist does. Think about what the anxious person does. They're connecting superstitious things that aren't happening. They're not real. And they're connecting them to the real world. They're projecting out their fears into the real world that may not actually even exist for them. So what we're able to do is use this as an interesting way of personal development. There's no therapeutic model here. There's no technique process from any of the like CBT or NLP that would replicate this. This enables us now to start to play with concepts that we wouldn't otherwise be aware of. So what would happen if you could connect your creativity to your real manifest world without it deceiving you and being misled by suggestion from other people's superstitious nonsense? And so that's essentially what the path of the moon would represent at this level. It has other stuff to it too. So that's just one of those things. Now, of course, we've got 22 variations on these, which are very linear. It connects these two experiences, connects these two experiences, we can connect these two. But in magic, in Kabbalistic orientated magic, we're going much further than that, because we're able to juxtapose things across context and start to mix and match these concepts to take us into interesting areas of personal exploration. This serves as a guide, for a terrible term, but it serves as a guide to start to organize experience and to sort through experiences that we wouldn't otherwise even conceive existed. For example, this one here, I know so well, people never even think about. How much nonsense do I listen to from coaches and therapists? I'm just like, what are you doing? You know that, but you can't stop them, because they don't understand that actually manifesting this superstitious nonsense into the real world is a creative process, but it's not necessarily one that's going to be very useful. Now, the path that connects Hod to Netzer. So remember, Hod is intellect, or the will to intellect, the will to know. And Netzer is very much in the realm of creativity. The path that connects here is the blasted tower. And the symbolism of the blasted tower is a tower that has been struck by lightning. Sometimes there is an external force as well coming at it, and the tower is collapsing and there are people falling out of it. Now, this is such an archetypal symbol. It's amazing. And it's one of my particular favourites. Generally, your tarot readers, the fortune tellers who never really paid attention to the archetypes, they kind of get it right. But they see this as a wholly negative card. Now, what the tower represents symbolically is it is the loss of the false self mediated through external force. So essentially, this is the really bad day that just keeps getting worse, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're screwed. It doesn't matter. You're nothing you can do. And I think we've all had phases in our lives where this has happened. You lose a job, and as a result of losing a job, you can't pay the rent. And as long as you're not paying the rent, you can lose your house. And then it just goes, and it snowballs. And then when it gets worse, it just gets even worse. And then you feel really bad, and you're not functioning particularly well. And then you start falling out with people. It just gets worse. Being autobiographical here. Many people have had that. Now, that's not what the tower symbolizes. But when that happens, and it becomes the best thing that's ever happened to you, because you wake up to your own nonsense, even if you didn't create the nonsense, even if this was not of your creation, but you wake up to this, you become aware of the persona, the false self, the ego, that actually the lies that you've told about yourself to yourself, and you get to stop doing that, and you emerge a better person. Basically, that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That's what this path is. When it's just negative trauma and there's bad stuff happening, that's not what this is. That's just this bad stuff happening. But when we have bad stuff that enables us to be liberated, and that's the symbolism of the card. The people in the tower, notice they're in an elevated position. That tower is destroyed and they are freed from that. But at the point they're falling, I don't think they would go, yay, we're free. No, we've been struck by lightning and now we're falling to our deaths. That's generally how they'll be experiencing that. But the reality is it enables them to, the false ego is destroyed. This, by the way, is that the level 3 of my Metaphors of Movement training is built entirely around the archetypal symbolism of this path. I'm just giving you a very, very brief overview of the path here. There's more than what I'm saying, just to make that clear. So, now, what would happen if we initiate on this path? Rather than having intellect and creativity as being separate, we can now have unity between the two. Instead of having left brain doing left brain stuff and right brain doing right brain stuff, and having these quite abstract things where we're lurching from panic and worry at one moment and then talking to ourselves and reassuring ourselves at the next, and backs and forwards, what would happen if we created unity between the two? And largely this destructive element that is symbolized by the tower, or symbolized by this path, is representative of how we can start to unite the intellectual and the creative part and bring them together in a much more creative way. So one of the things we can do, and this is what the Kabbalistic and magical practices and meditations are about, are ways of bringing about unity through disparate parts, utilizing the archetypes. Now, if there's interest in the archetypes, I'm quite happy to go through those. It's a lot. There's a lot of stuff there, and it's I love it, so I'm more than happy to talk about it. But I don't want to go through it all if people aren't really interested in it. The one thing I will say at this moment in time is that when I hear trainers talking about archetypes, they have it entirely wrong. There's a number of people who have essentially, these are NLP trainers who have ripped off my Metaphors work. And there's another one this week that I've become aware of. Now, what they've done is they've ripped off the work, and I've confronted all of them on it. And what they'll do is go, no, you've just taken this stuff from George Lakoff. You've just taken this stuff from Mies, or whatever her name is, I can't remember her name. And I haven't. That's not where the work comes from. They just don't know it any deeper than that. And so what they're doing is they're taking my material, reattributing it where they think it's safe to do, and then are saying, I'm now teaching according to Caroline Mies, I'm teaching this according to Lakoff, and they're not at all. I think they assume I don't know Lakoff and don't know Mies, but who knows. The problem they've got is when they are, instead of using metaphor, they're using the word archetypes, and they think, say if we look at Krishna and Jesus, archetypally they're said to be very similar. There's a lot of similarities between them, and then we can also bring in the Egyptian god form Horus as well, and there's lots of symbolisms of them. Jesus is not the archetype, Horus is not the archetype, Krishna is not the archetype. There are different expressions of the same archetype. The moment we try and get into what is the archetype, we're into the ineffable. It is beyond language, which is why in the spiritual texts and the magical texts, the god forms are usually used, and the archetype is above the reference point of the god form. So the god form itself is a useful reference point. It's the highest we can go before we get into the ineffable. And essentially the spiritual traditions will say the ineffable is God, the true God, but it's unreachable by man. We can't even speak his name. It is unspeakable. It is beyond language. It is something outside of the concept, which is why we have to create lower level gods as high level symbolism of the archetype. So just to say it again, things like Jesus, Krishna and Horus, they're not archetypes, but they are different expressions of the archetype. We will use those terms and say, yeah, the Jesus archetype, the Horus archetype, as a point of convenience, but it's not really the archetype, if that makes any sense. You'll know the people who've ripped off my work because on their YouTube videos they're talking all the time about archetypes, but actually when they use the word archetype they actually are using metaphor taxonomies, and that's what they're referring to, which is just not correct at all. What I do have is that the majority of the metaphors work that I do and the taxonomies have come through an understanding of the archetypes that I have learned over the years through these practices. And that the classical stories, especially scriptural stories, things from the Greek classics, the great stories that get retold across thousands of years. There's the clue there. They have high archetypal value, which is why they're the stories that last. And of the thousands of other stories that emerge every year, they disappear because they're very localized to specific events. But some stories are big archetypal content, and that's why they resonate so powerfully with people over such wide spans of time, but also across large portions of population, because they have high archetypal content, and the retelling shapes them accordingly, and then they solidify. Within those stories, what you can start to find is, so how does, if we take the planet Mars, or the god Mars, how does he behave? If we take Jupiter, this is much more about structure and construction and stability, but also about forgiveness. It's easier to be very forgiving when you're stable. Hence why Jupiter and forgiveness do go hand in hand. When you're feeling unstable and insecure, it's very difficult to be very forgiving. But when you have a lot of strength and a lot of stability, then you're actually able to be a lot more forgiving. What we can start to do is to look into the ancient stories. How did those embodiments of the archetype behave and interact with each other? Because now you can start to get some behavioral cues and clues about how to work with your own symbolism, your own metaphors and experiences. Because we're limited on what we have learned ourselves in terms of how to behave. As children, we had strong identification with various characters from movies and cartoons and in our comic books. We had various action heroes and fantasy heroes who we would identify with in varying forms. And that, if we were to use that as an embodiment of an archetype, enriches our internal world and gives us some degrees of flexibility. But we stuck with those and ignored the rest. What would happen if we strongly identified with all of the different embodiments of archetypes and reenacted either symbolically through meditation or dramatically through ritual and ceremony, like in magic? We start to create an enrichment and variation as we learn the different archetypes that people are embodying, and we know the variables by which they interact with each other and what the results are. And largely for me, these classical texts that are reverberated through the years are really good demonstrations of the kind of interactions that people like. And that's why they retell the story, because it resonates powerfully. So a lot of the work that I've developed from the metaphor stuff has been derived through modelling out some of those things within those classical stories. Now, the ones I've used are predominantly biblical, simply because in the Western traditions, Western culture, the Bible was the number one influence. If I was in Asia, I'd be looking at the Vedas or the Hindu texts. Obviously, there's loads of them. And so if I was in the Middle East, I'll be looking at the Islamic text and the Jewish ones as well, because they are hugely influential in the cultures there. So I think that's all I want to go through with this one. If anyone has any specific questions or things they'd like me to cover on archetypes, on any of the stories that I utilize, on Kabbalah itself and tarot symbolism, then I'd be delighted. No, I'm not going to tell you a fortune. That's nonsense, by the way, and anyone who tells you otherwise is a fool.